The man on the platform cleared his throat. His name was Broker, and that was all anyone called him. "Next, we have a special case," he announced, his voice slick with false pity. "A contract paid in full. But the groom, well, he found a prettier flower before this one arrived." Laughter rippled through the dusty town square. Alara stood beside the platform, not on it. That was the one dignity she had been allowed. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her down not with desire, but with appraisal. The kind of appraisal one gives a plow horse with a lame leg. "She is sturdy," Broker continued, searching for a kind word and failing. "Wide-hipped and heavy-footed, but strong. Good for work. Comes with no family, no debts. A clean slate." He was selling her like a sack of flour. No, less than that. Flour was a staple, something everyone needed. She was a surplus, an unwanted burden. A man in the front row, his belly straining the buttons of his vest, called out, "What's wrong with her, Broker? Why'd the groom back out?" Broker smiled, a predator's gleam in his eye. "He said he ordered a songbird and got a crow." The laughter was louder this time. It was a physical thing, a wave of heat and scorn that washed over Alara, threatening to buckle her knees. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on the warped boards of the general store across the square. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. Her father had done this. He had taken the money, signed the papers, and shipped her west like a piece of freight. He had told her it was a good match, a chance to be a wife, to have a home. He had lied. He had sold her to the first man who would pay, and when that man rejected her, she was passed to a broker to be disposed of. "She can read and write," Broker added, as if it were a strange and useless feature, like a horse that could count. "And she knows her numbers. Might be useful for a man who can't be bothered with his own books." The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. It was a silence of dismissal. No one wanted a sturdy, plain woman who knew her numbers. They wanted pretty and pliable. They wanted songbirds. Alara felt a cold fury begin to burn through the shame. It started in her belly and spread through her veins, a welcome fire in the frozen landscape of her humiliation. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting Broker's. "I am not a parcel to be rerouted," she said, her voice low and tight, but carrying in the sudden quiet. Broker's smile faltered. He was not used to the merchandise speaking back. Now, girl," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "No need for hysterics." "I am not hysterical," Alara said, taking a step toward the platform. The crowd murmured. "I am a person. My name is Alara, and you have no right to stand there and sell me like livestock." He was wrong. She was not a crow. Crows were smart. They remembered faces. They held grudges. Broker's face hardened. The mask of the genial salesman dropped, revealing the cold contempt beneath. "Your father's contract says otherwise. You are a debt paid. That is all." He turned his back on her, addressing the crowd again. "Any man here need a housekeeper? $50 and her contract is yours. She's already proven she has a mouth on her, but a firm hand can fix that." The humiliation was complete. She had spoken up, and it had only made things worse. She was not just unwanted. She was now difficult. Damaged goods. She turned and walked away. Not ran. Walked. Each step was a deliberate act of will. She could feel every eye on her back. A physical weight. She did not look back. She walked until she turned the corner of the livery, out of sight of the square. The alley stank of hay and manure. She leaned against the rough wood of the stable wall, the splinters digging into her palms. And there, in the shadows, she let the tears come. They were not silent, dignified tears. They were wrenching sobs that tore from her throat, hot and agonizing. It was the grief of a lifetime of being overlooked, of being told in 1,000 small ways that she was not enough. It was the rage of this final, public degradation. The sound of her own crying was ugly in the small space. A wounded animal. When the sobs finally subsided, a cold resolve settled in their place. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, her sleeve coming away damp and dirty. She made a vow, not to God, not to the heavens, but to the gritty, unforgiving dirt beneath her worn shoes. Never again. Never again would she trust a man's promise. Never again would she place her fate in someone else's hands. Father, groom, broker, they were all the same, traitors in flesh and hope. From this moment on, she would rely on herself. She would be her own fortress. She would survive, not because of anyone's kindness, but in spite of their cruelty. She would be a stone, hard and unmoving. Let them try to break her again. A shadow fell over the mouth of the alley. Alara flinched, her body tensing for another blow, another insult. A man stood there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun. He was tall, but he did not fill the space with arrogance. He just occupied it. He wore a dusty hat and a worn coat. He did not move forward. "Miss Alara?" he asked. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a slow river. She did not answer. She watched him, her heart hammering a panicked rhythm against her ribs. He took a step into the alley, and the light caught his face. It was a weathered face, carved by sun and wind. His eyes were not mocking or pitying. They were assessing. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence that needs mending, calculating what was broken and what was required to fix it. "My name is Caleb," he said. "I'm the one who paid your contract." Alara's new vow echoed in her ears. Never trust. "So you're the one who decided I wasn't pretty enough." A flicker of something, confusion, maybe, crossed his face. "No, ma'am. That was another man. I heard what he did. I heard broker was planning to sell your contract to the miners up at Black Creek." She knew about the mining camps. She knew what happened to women there. "I paid broker what he was asking," Caleb continued, his gaze steady. "To keep you from that." Alara stared at him, suspicion warring with a desperate, treacherous flicker of hope. "Why?" "It wasn't right," he said simply, as if that explained everything. What he was doing. What they were all doing. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. It was a gesture of respect she had not been shown all day. "I run a ranch a day's ride from here. The Broken Rock." Broken. Seemed fitting. "I am not for sale," she said, the words sharp. "I know," he said. "I didn't buy you. I bought a piece of paper that was causing you harm. The paper is ash now. I burned it on my way over here." She searched his face for a lie, for the trick. There was none. There was only a quiet earnestness that was more disarming than any charm. "My wagon is over here," he said, gesturing with his head. "I can take you back to town, leave you at the boarding house. Or you can come out to the ranch. There's a room. It has a lock on the inside. I'll pay you a fair wage for any work you do. You'd be free to leave any time you see fit." Freedom. A room with a lock. Wages. These were concepts from another world. She had been prepared to be a possession. She did not know how to be an employee. "Why would you do that?" she asked again, her voice smaller this time. "I need help," he said, with no shame in the admission. "The ranch is struggling, and it's not right for a person to be left with no choice." He was offering her a choice, the first real one she'd had since leaving home. To stay here, in this town that had laughed at her, with no money and no friends. Or to go with this strange, quiet man to a place called Broken Rock. It was a choice between two unknowns, but one unknown came with a lock on the door. She looked down at her hands, then back at his steady eyes. "I can work," she said. It was all she had to offer. "I expect you can," he said. He put his hat back on. "The wagon is this way." Ja. The journey was long and silent. The wagon seat was hard. The road a rutted track through endless, rolling hills of brown grass. Caleb did not speak, and Alara was grateful for it. She had no words left. She sat straight-backed, her hands clenched in her lap, watching the landscape pass. It was a harsh country, beautiful in its own stark way. The sky was immense, a deep and unforgiving blue. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Caleb finally broke the silence. "Are you hungry?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. She was. A gnawing emptiness had hollowed out her stomach. But to admit a need felt like a weakness, a concession. She had been so focused on survival she had forgotten the simple mechanics of it. She gave a short, non-committal nod. He pulled the wagon to a stop beside a small, gurgling creek. He got down without a word and came back with a cloth-wrapped bundle. He handed it to her. "I'll water the horses," he said, and walked away, leaving her in the privacy of the fading light. Her fingers fumbled with the knot. Inside were 2 thick slices of bread, a chunk of yellow cheese, and a hard red apple. It was simple food, but it felt like a banquet. She ate quickly, almost shamefully, as if the offer might be rescinded. The bread was dense and slightly stale, the cheese sharp on her tongue. It was the most delicious meal she had ever eaten. It was the first act of non-transactional kindness she had received in months. He had not asked for anything. He had simply seen a need and met it. He had given her food, and then he had given her the dignity of eating it alone. This small gesture cracked something in the stone fortress she had built around her heart. Tiny hairline fracture. When he returned, she had finished. She folded the cloth neatly and held it out to him. He just nodded and took it, his fingers brushing hers for a brief second. A spark of warmth. "We're about an hour out," he said, climbing back onto the wagon seat. The rest of the ride passed in a deepening twilight. She felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. She was still wary, still suspicious, but the raw, jagged edges of her pain had been smoothed just slightly. They arrived at the Broken Rock Ranch in near darkness. A single lantern burned on the porch of a long, low house. The place looked tired. The fence line sagged in places, and the barn door hung crooked on one hinge. It was a place that had seen better days, a place holding on by a thread. Felt familiar. "The house isn't much," Caleb said, as if sensing her thoughts. "My wife. She passed 2 years ago. I haven't had the heart for it since." He led her inside. The main room was cluttered but not dirty. Books were piled on a table, and a half-finished harness lay draped over a chair. It was the room of a man who worked until he fell into bed, too exhausted for anything else. "This will be your room," he said, opening a door. It was small. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden dresser, a window looking out into the blackness. And on the inside of the door, a small, black iron bolt. A lock. "Breakfast is at sunrise," he said from the doorway. "Jeb, my foreman, and the 2 hands eat in the kitchen. You're welcome to join. Or not. Your choice." He started to turn away. "Mr. Caleb," she said, her voice raspy. He stopped and looked at her. "Thank you," she whispered. He just gave a slight nod. "Get some rest, Miss Alara." He closed the door behind him, leaving her alone. She walked to the door and slid the bolt home. The solid click echoed in the small room. It was the sound of safety, the sound of a promise kept. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under her weight. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was in a room she could close against the world. She was not property. She was not a burden. She was a person with a locked door. And in the quiet dark of the Broken Rock Ranch, Alara allowed herself a small, fragile sliver of hope.
Vuge.
The next morning, Alara rose before the sun. She found the kitchen in a state of organized chaos. Tin plates and cups were stacked by a wash basin, and a pot of coffee simmered on the stove. It was a man's kitchen, functional and devoid of any touch of softness. She did not join them for breakfast. Instead, she found a broom and began to sweep. She washed the dishes. She wiped down the long wooden table. She worked silently, methodically. It was a language she understood. To bring order to a small corner of the world was to reclaim a piece of herself. When the men came in from their morning chores, they found the kitchen clean. An old man with a face like a dried apple and 2 young hands barely old enough to grow beards stopped in the doorway, surprised. Caleb stood behind them. The old man, Jeb, grunted. The two young hands, Billy and Tom, just stared. "Smells like soap," Billy said, as if it were a foreign scent. Caleb's eyes met Ilara's. He didn't say anything, but she saw a flicker of gratitude. He simply picked up a plate and served himself some of the stew she had found simmering and ladled into clean bowls. Days fell into a rhythm. Ilara took over the house. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She learned the quiet habits of the four men. Jeb's grunts, which could mean anything from approval to disgust. Billy's endless, nervous energy. Tom's quiet shyness. And Caleb's profound, bone-deep weariness. She never sat with them. She ate her meals alone after they had finished. She kept her distance, a ghost in the house they lived in. She was polite, efficient, and invisible. She was earning her keep. She was honoring her side of the bargain. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, she was scrubbing the porch when a commotion erupted from the direction of the creek. Billy came running, his face pale with panic. "Caleb, the pump's busted again. We've got no water coming up to the troughs." Caleb and Jeb strode toward the creek, their faces grim. Ilara watched them go, then slowly, she followed. She stood at a distance, by a cluster of cottonwood trees, as the three men gathered around the large, iron water pump. It was a vital piece of machinery, pulling water from the creek up the hill to the holding tank that fed the entire ranch. "The main gear's stripped," Jeb said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Same as last time. We replace it. It'll just strip again in a month." Caleb knelt, running a hand over the machine. His shoulders were slumped in defeat. "A new pump assembly costs $300. Money I don't have. We can haul water in buckets for a day or two," Tom suggested quietly. "But the herd's too big. We can't keep up." Ilara looked at the pump. Then she looked past it, her eyes following the wide intake pipe that disappeared into the murky creek water. She looked upstream, then downstream. She saw how the creek bent sharply about a quarter-mile down. She saw the way the current flowed, the way silt and debris would naturally collect on the inside of that bend. She had spent her childhood on a farm with a failing irrigation system. Her father had cursed the equipment, replaced parts, spent money he didn't have. It was Ilara, a quiet girl of 15, who had walked the ditches and found the real problem. A collapsed culvert 2 miles away that was starving the whole system of pressure. Her father had taken the credit. She had never forgotten the lesson. She stepped forward. "It's not the gear," she said. The four men turned to look at her. It was the first time she had offered an opinion on anything outside the kitchen. Jeb squinted at her. "What's that, Missy?" "The gear is stripping because the pump is working too hard," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "It's pulling against a blockage. The problem isn't here. It's in the pipe." Caleb stood up, his gaze sharpening. "The pipe is clear. We checked the first 20 feet. The blockage won't be at the start," she said, pointing. "It will be down there where the creek turns. The current slows and the silt builds up. It's probably been happening for years, getting worse and worse. Now it's almost completely choked off. The pump is trying to suck a gallon of water through a straw." The men were silent, staring at her. She felt a flush of self-consciousness. She was just a woman, a cook. What did she know of pumps and water pressure? But Caleb was not looking at her like she was a woman. He was looking at her like she was a solution. He was looking at her the way he'd looked at that broken fence. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice quiet. "My father's farm had a creek like this," she said. "Same problem. Same pump." Caleb looked from her to the creek, then back again. A decision was made. "Jeb, Tom, get the shovels and the winch from the barn. Billy, you ride upstream and see if you can divert some of the flow. We're going to pull that pipe." Took them the rest of the afternoon. It was heavy, muddy work. Ilara brought them water and, when it was done, a hot meal. She did not watch them work. She had said her piece. Now it was up to them. Late that evening, as she was banking the fire in the kitchen, Caleb came in. He was covered in mud, but his face was different. The exhaustion was still there, but it was overshadowed by something else. A light. "You were right," he said. She just nodded, continuing her work. The last 100 feet of the pipe were packed solid with silt and roots. "We cleared it. The pump is working better than it has in years. The gear will hold now." He stood there for a moment watching her. "Supper was good," he said. Coming from him, the two simple sentences felt like a speech. The first was an acknowledgement of her mind. The second, an acknowledgement of her care. She finally stopped and looked at him. "I'm glad I could help." He took a step closer. "What else can you do, Alara?" The question hung in the air between them. It was not a demand. It was a question of genuine, astonished curiosity. He was not asking what chores she could perform. He was asking who she was. What depths were hidden beneath the quiet, plain surface. "I know my numbers," she said softly, echoing Broker's mocking words. But this time they didn't feel like a flaw. They felt like a weapon. Caleb's expression grew more serious. "My numbers are killing me," he confessed. "The ranch, it's been losing money for 2 years. A little at first, now a lot. I sell more cattle every year, but I end up with less in my pocket. I can't find the leak." He hesitated, then made a decision. "Tomorrow, would you be willing to look at my ledgers?" She met his gaze. He was not asking her to be a cook or a housekeeper. He was asking her to be a partner, a strategist. He was seeing past her wide hips and heavy feet. He was seeing her mind. "Yes," she said. "I'll look at your books." Chug. The ledgers were a story of slow, creeping death. Alara spread them across the kitchen table, the one space in the house large enough. For 3 days she barely spoke. She traced columns of figures with her finger, her brow furrowed in concentration. She made notes on scraps of paper. She drank pot after pot of black coffee. The men left her alone. They tiptoed around her, speaking in hushed tones. They seemed to understand that a vital, delicate operation was underway. Caleb's bookkeeping was meticulous but unsophisticated. He recorded every sale, every expense. On the surface, it looked like the simple story of a failing business. Rising costs for feed and equipment, falling prices for beef. Bad luck. A bad run. But Alara saw something else. She saw a pattern. It was in the small things. An invoice for fence wire that was 10% higher than the previous one, from the same supplier. A bill for veterinary services for a sickness that, according to the ranch hand's log, had never occurred. A recurring transport fee on cattle sales that hadn't existed 3 years ago. Each one was small enough to be overlooked, a rounding error, a minor price hike. But added together over 2 years they were a torrent. It wasn't a leak. It was a siphon. Someone was deliberately bleeding the broken rock dry. She cross-referenced the invoices with the bank drafts. And there, she found the name. The payments for all these inflated and fraudulent expenses were funneled through a single holding company. And the bank that managed the drafts, the bank that held Caleb's mortgage, was the Garrison County Bank. President Silas Thorne. The name was familiar. Caleb had mentioned him. Thorne was a friend of his late wife's family. He had been so helpful after she passed, consolidating Caleb's loans, offering advice, offering a shoulder to cry on. On the 4th day, Alara looked up from the books. Her eyes were gritty with exhaustion, but her mind was sharp and clear. Caleb was on the porch, mending a bridle. She walked out and stood before him. "It's not bad luck," she said. "It's theft." She laid it all out for him. The patterns, the inflated invoices, the ghost expenses. She showed him the name on the drafts. She explained how Thorne was using his position at the bank to approve the payments, slowly strangling the ranch while pretending to be its savior. His goal was obvious: to force Caleb into foreclosure so he could buy the land and its precious water rights for pennies on the dollar. Caleb listened, his face growing harder and colder with every word. The weathered calm she had come to know was replaced by a gathering storm. When she finished, he stood up, his fists clenched. The bridle fell to the porch floor. "Thorne," he said, the name a curse. I'll kill him. As if summoned, a cloud of dust appeared on the road leading to the ranch. A fine, black buggy, pulled by a pair of matched gray horses, was approaching. It was the kind of rig that screamed of money and influence. "That's him," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. The buggy pulled up, and a man stepped down. He was handsome, dressed in a tailored city suit that was comically out of place in the dusty ranch yard. He had a politician's smile, wide and empty. Silas Thorne. He saw Caleb and his smile widened. "Caleb, my friend. I was just in the area. Thought I'd stop by and see how you're holding up." Then his eyes landed on Alara, standing beside Caleb on the porch. His gaze swept over her, taking in her plain dress, her sturdy frame. It was a look of instant, dismissive assessment, and then a flicker of recognition. "Well, now," Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescension. "What have we here?" "Caleb, I didn't realize you'd found yourself some company." He looked back at Alara, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "You look familiar. Didn't I see you in town square last month?" Broker was having a hard time moving his inventory, as I recall. The blow was as sharp and public as the first one. He was reminding her of what she was. He was reminding Caleb of what she was. A piece of unwanted merchandise. He was trying to drive a wedge between them, to reestablish the social order where men like him held all the power, and women like her had none. Caleb took a step forward, his body radiating menace. But Alara put a hand on his arm. It was a small gesture, but firm. "Don't," she said softly. Caleb stopped, looking down at her. He saw not fear in her eyes, but a cold, calculated calm. He saw a strategist who had just seen the enemy's first move. She turned her gaze back to Thorne. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. She let his insult hang in the air, a foul odor that clung only to him. Thorne's smirk wavered. He had expected tears or shame, or a retreat into the house. He had not expected this quiet, unnerving stillness. He had identified her as a weakness, a vulnerability he could exploit. He was wrong. "Mr. Thorne," Caleb said, his voice dangerously level. Alara's hand on his arm was a grounding force, pulling him back from the brink of violence. "You're not welcome here. Get off my land." Thorne's mask of charm dropped completely. His eyes went cold. "It won't be your land for much longer, dirt scrabbler," he hissed. "The bank is calling in your note. You have 30 days. He climbed back into his buggy, a flash of fury on his handsome face. He had come expecting to find a broken man. He had found that man, but he had also found something he hadn't counted on. He had found Alara. As the buggy sped away, Caleb turned to her. The rage was still in him, but it was now tempered by a dawning realization. "He's been robbing me blind for 2 years, he said, his voice rough with betrayal. "And I thanked him for it." He looked ready to tear the world apart with his bare hands. "A hot fire burns out fast," Alara said quietly. "He wants you to be angry. He wants you to ride into town and accuse him. You have no proof, only my word against his. Who do you think they'll believe?" She was right. He was a struggling rancher. Thorne was the most powerful man in the county. "He thinks I'm your weakness," she continued. "He thinks I'm just some fat girl you picked up for cheap. He doesn't know that I'm the one who found him out. We will not fight him his way with fists and fury. We will fight him my way, with his own numbers, with the truth." She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "We need evidence, Caleb. Hard evidence. Copies of the originals. We need to build a case so solid that no one can deny it." Caleb stared at her, at the woman who had been publicly shamed, who had every reason to be broken. And here she was planning a war. He saw the strength he had only glimpsed now on full display. "We?" he repeated softly, latching onto the word. It was the first time she had used it. It was a declaration of allegiance. She was no longer just an employee. She was a defender of the broken rock. "Yes," she said. "We." A slow nod from Caleb. He had been fighting a ghost, a string of bad luck. Now he had an enemy with a name. And more importantly, he had an ally. "All right, Alara," he said, her name feeling solid and real on his tongue. "We do it your way."
Vuge.
The next 2 weeks were a quiet, desperate battle. Caleb made a trip to the county seat, 3 days' ride away, on the pretense of pricing new bulls. His real mission was to visit the land registry office. He came back with copies of deeds and water rights filings, showing a pattern of Thorn buying up ranches that bordered the Broken Rock, ranches that had all mysteriously failed. Alara, meanwhile, became a ghost in the town of Garrison. Twice a week, Caleb would drive her in, leaving her at the dressmaker's shop. From there, she would slip out the back. She spent hours in the back room of the telegraph office, paying the young clerk $1, a fortune to him, to let her look through old financial wire transfers. She sat in the dusty basement of the county clerk's office, poring over tax records. She was building her case piece by painstaking piece. Each fraudulent invoice, each falsified transport fee, was a stone in the foundation of the wall she was building around Silas Thorn. But Thorn was not idle. He felt the ground shifting beneath him. He couldn't know the details, but he knew the man he had been slowly strangling was suddenly fighting back. And he knew it had started when the woman arrived. The whispers began in town. Malicious, ugly rumors. The fat mail-order bride was a witch, they said. She'd put a spell on poor Caleb, widowed and grieving. She was a gold digger, trying to sink her hooks into his land. The townspeople, who had laughed at her humiliation, now clutched at this new narrative, eager to pass judgment. Then the attacks became more direct. A section of fence was cut one night, and 30 head of cattle wandered off, lost to the canyons. A week later, Jeb found one of their best breeding bulls dead by the creek, the water tainted with poison. The pressure mounted. The 30-day deadline loomed. The ranch hands grew tense and quiet. They looked at Alara with a new uncertainty. Was she the cause of all this? Alara felt their suspicion like a physical weight. The old shame, the feeling of being a burden, a curse, began to creep back in. She saw the strain on Caleb's face, the deep lines of worry etched around his eyes. He never blamed her, never even hinted at it. He defended her fiercely to the hands, his loyalty absolute. But she saw the cost. One evening, she overheard Billy and Tom talking by the corral. "It was never this bad before she came," Billy said, his voice low. "It's like she brought the devil with her." The words pierced her. They confirmed her deepest, darkest fear, that she was the problem, that her presence, her fight, was only bringing more ruin down on this man who had shown her kindness. Thorn's strategy was working. He wasn't just attacking the ranch, he was attacking her right to be there. That night, she made a decision. It was an act of love, the only one she felt she could give. She would remove the curse. She would leave. She waited until the house was dark and quiet. She packed her few belongings into the same small bag she had arrived with. She wrote a note, leaving it on the kitchen table next to the ledgers. In the note, she explained everything. She laid out the entire case against Thorn, telling Caleb what evidence he still needed and where to find it. She told him to give it to the sheriff. She told him he had a better chance of being believed without her. She ended the letter simply. "You saved me from Black Creek. Now I am saving you from me." With tears streaming down her face, she slipped out the front door and into the moonless night. She would walk to town. She would disappear. She was halfway to the main gate when a hellish orange glow erupted against the night sky. The barn. Flames were already licking up the dry timber sides, roaring into the darkness. A shout came from the house, then another. She froze, her plan to flee forgotten, her heart seizing with terror. Then she heard a scream, not of fear, but of agony. It was Tom. She ran, back toward the fire, back toward the home she was trying to abandon. The whole ranch was awake. Jeb was trying to organize a bucket brigade from the well, a futile effort. Billy was trying to drive the terrified horses from the corral next to the burning barn. Caleb came sprinting out of the house, his face a mask of horror. "Tom's in there," Billy screamed, pointing at the inferno. The loft gave way. "He's trapped." Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed a wet blanket from the brigade line and wrapped it around himself. "No!" Jeb yelled. "It's a furnace. You'll never make it out." But Caleb was already gone, a dark figure plunging into the roaring heart of the fire. Alara stood, paralyzed, watching the flames consume the barn, consume the man who had shown her what worth felt like. And in that moment she saw him, Silas Thorne. He was sitting on his horse on the ridge overlooking the ranch, a lone silhouette against the fiery glow. He was watching his handiwork, watching the broken rock die. Seconds stretched into an eternity. The roof of the barn groaned, ready to collapse. Then, a figure stumbled out of the swirling smoke and embers. It was Caleb, half carrying, half dragging the unconscious form of young Tom. Caleb's hair was singed, his shirt was smoldering. He laid Tom on the ground, away from the heat, and collapsed, coughing, his body racked with tremors. Jeb and Billy rushed to them. Tom had a broken leg and bad burns, but he was alive. Caleb had saved him. He had chosen a life over his livelihood. The barn and everything in it, hay, equipment, his last remaining assets, was gone. Alara ran to Caleb's side. He looked up at her through smoke-stung eyes. He saw the bag in her hand, the tracks of her tears on her dusty face. He understood. "You were leaving," he rasped, his voice raw. She couldn't speak. She just knelt beside him, her heart breaking. He reached out, his hand closing around her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong. "Don't," he said, his voice filled with a desperate, ragged passion. "Don't you dare leave. I'm ruining you," she sobbed. "It's all my fault." "No," he said, pulling himself up to a sitting position. He ignored Jeb trying to tend to his burns. His eyes were locked on hers. "You are the only thing that is not ruined. You are the only reason we've lasted this long. I was drowning, Alara, sinking in the dark. And then you came. You turned on a light." He held her wrist tighter. "Everything I have may be gone. But if you walk away, then I'll have lost everything that matters. Don't let him win. Don't let him take you from me, too." His words shattered the last of her doubt. He was not asking her to stay for his sake. He was asking her to stay for theirs. This was their fight. She looked from his determined, soot-stained face to the silhouette of Silas Thorne on the ridge. The fire had taken the barn, but it had forged something new in its place.
En imbrécable alliance.
She dropped her bag in the dirt. "All right, Caleb," she said, her voice clear and strong over the roar of the fire. "He wanted a war. Now he'll get 1 inch.
Vouguet.
The foreclosure auction was set for Friday. It was held in the town hall, the same building that housed the county clerk's office where Alara had spent so many hours. The room was packed. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the final public death of the Broken Rock Ranch. Alara and Caleb walked in together. A hush fell over the room. Caleb's face was grim, his hands showing fresh burns. Alara walked beside him, her head held high. She carried a single, worn leather satchel. They took seats in the front row. The same faces that had watched her in the square were now watching her again. She felt their stares, but this time, there was no shame. There was only cold, clear purpose. Silas Thorne stood at the front of the room, next to the auctioneer. He was dressed impeccably, the picture of civic leadership and sober finance. He gave Caleb a look of feigned sympathy. When his eyes met Alara's, they were filled with triumphant contempt. He believed he had won. He had burned them out, reduced them to nothing. The auctioneer, a man on Thorne's payroll, began the proceedings. He read the legal notices, his voice droning on about debts and defaults. And so, the property known as the Broken Rock Ranch, with all its lands and water rights, is now forfeit and will be sold to the highest bidder. Thorne stepped forward. "A tragedy," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "Caleb is a good man, just a poor businessman. To ensure the land is well managed, and on behalf of the bank, I will open the bidding at $500. It was an insultingly low number, a tenth of its true value even in its current state. No one else would bid. Thorne had made it clear this land was his. Is there another bid? The auctioneer asked, already knowing the answer. There is. The voice was Alara's. It cut through the silent room like a shard of glass. Every head turned toward her. She stood up, her satchel in her hand. The auctioneer frowned. Ma'am, this is a legal proceeding for bidders with capital. My capital is truth, Alara said, walking to the front of the room. She placed her satchel on the table. And I have a claim to make. This foreclosure is fraudulent. It is the result of a deliberate, criminal conspiracy orchestrated by Mr. Silas Thorne. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Thorne laughed. A short, ugly bark. This is absurd. The ravings of a desperate woman. Sheriff, remove her. The sheriff, a portly man who valued peace above justice, took a hesitant step forward. Let her speak. Caleb's voice boomed from his seat. Or every man in this room will know you're Thorne's dog on a leash. The sheriff froze. All eyes were on Alara. She opened her satchel and began. She did not raise her voice. She did not use rhetoric. She used facts. She laid out the copied invoices, the forged transport manifests, the land registry deeds showing Thorne's pattern of predatory acquisition. She held up the telegraph office records. For 2 years, she said, her voice clear and steady, Mr. Thorne has siphoned money from the Broken Rock, a little here, a little there, death by 1,000 cuts. He used his position as bank president to hide his tracks, making it look like bad luck, like poor management. She then produced a map she had drawn herself, showing the Broken Rock and the surrounding properties Thorne had acquired. It was never about the ranch, she explained. It was about the water. The Broken Rock controls the headwaters of the entire valley. With that water, all this other land, she swept her hand across the map, becomes 10 times more valuable. He wasn't buying a ranch. He was stealing a kingdom. The crowd was murmuring, the tide of their opinion beginning to turn. They were seeing the logic, the undeniable proof in the papers she laid out. Thorne's face was pale, his composure cracking. Lies. These are forgeries. This is the fantasy of a bitter, penniless woman who tried to trap a good man. Alara looked at him, her gaze piercing. And the fire, Mr. Thorne? Was that a fantasy, too? The fire that nearly killed a boy and destroyed the last of Caleb's assets, just days before the foreclosure deadline. What convenient timing. Thorne's rage finally broke its leash. He took a step toward her, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure venom. You did this, he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at her. You think you can come here, a fat, mail-order scrap nobody wanted, and undo my work? I built my life in this valley while you were being passed around like a cheap plate of food. The room fell into a shocked silence. The ugliness of his words, the raw, undisguised cruelty, confirmed everything Alara had just claimed. He had revealed himself. But Alara wasn't finished. She had saved her final move. You're right about one thing, Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. It was a terrible fire. So hot. It's a miracle Tom survived. The doctor said the burns on his legs were so severe because his trousers had melted to his skin. She paused, letting the silence stretch. The strange thing is, she continued, looking directly at the sheriff, his trousers were made of wool, and wool doesn't melt. Characters. It turns to ash. She turned her eyes back to Thorne. But denim, soaked in kerosene and then lit on fire, denim melts. Thorne's face went white. He had made a mistake. In his rage, in his need to control the narrative of the fire he had set, he had told everyone in town who would listen about the horror of the boy's melted trousers, a detail he could only know if he'd seen it up close, or if he had imagined it, based on the materials he himself had used. A detail Alara had heard him tell the blacksmith just that morning. I saw you, she said, her voice a final, damning judgment. I saw you on the ridge, watching it burn. Thorn stared at her, his mouth opening and closing. He was trapped, outmaneuvered, defeated not by a fist, but by a fact. By the mind of a woman he had dismissed as worthless. The sheriff, his face grim with realization, finally moved. He stepped up to Thorn. "Silas," he said quietly, "I think you'd better come with me." As the sheriff led a stunned and broken Silas Thorn out of the town hall, the room erupted. Not in laughter, but in applause. It started with one person, then another, then the whole room was on their feet, clapping. It was a roar of approval, of vindication. The sound washed over Elara. It was so different from the laughter she remembered. This sound filled her up, healed something deep inside her. Caleb came to her side. He didn't say a word. He just placed his hand on the small of her back, a quiet, solid presence. He let her have her moment, her victory. They walked out of the town hall and into the bright afternoon sun, leaving the noise and the crowd behind. They walked in silence back to the wagon. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The smoldering ruins of the barn stood as a monument to their struggle. They had won, but the cost was steep. They stood on the porch of the small house, looking out over the land. "It's not much what's left," Caleb said. "It's enough," Elara replied. "We can rebuild." Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. It was a deed, a new one, drawn up by the lawyer in the county seat. It deeded a full, equal half of the Broken Rock Ranch to Elara, not as a wife, but as a partner. "This isn't a gift," he said, his voice earnest. "It's not payment. It's an acknowledgement of what's true. You saved this place. You earned it. More than half, if we're being honest." She looked at the paper, then at him. Her eyes filled with tears, but these were different tears. They were tears of gratitude, of belonging. "I'm not asking you to marry me, Elara," he said, his voice soft. "I'm not asking you to be my wife. I am asking you to choose to stay, to be my partner, to build a life here with me, as my equal." She had started with nothing, a piece of human surplus. She had been offered a room with a lock, a wage, a choice. Now she was being offered a home, a future, not because a man wanted her, but because he valued her. She looked out at the rolling hills, at the vast open sky. It was a harsh land, but it was honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. Here, worth was not about prettiness. It was about resilience. It was about strength. It was about the ability to see a problem and know how to fix it. She had found her place, or rather, she had made it. "Yes," she said, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. "I choose to stay." He smiled, a true smile that reached his eyes and erased the lines of weariness. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused. Hers was steady and strong. They fit together perfectly. They stood there on the porch of their broken, battered, beautiful home, hands clasped, watching the sun begin to set. The fire had taken the past, but ahead of them, the future was a wide, open country, waiting for them to build it together.